All right, all systems go. Hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa, ni hao, jambo, marhaba. It's time for the Armist Inquisition yet again, episode 235 on Sunday, the 12th of June. I'm Amish Phil.
And I'm Amish Ben.
And tonight we've got a very special guest for you. We have Terry Boardman from 3man.org. How are you doing, Terry?
I'm fine, thanks, Phil. Ben, hi, good to see you.
Hi, Terry.
Nice to have you. I mentioned in our email that I'd heard you on the Delling pod recently, and I was incredibly intrigued with what you were saying. And then obviously I got directed to the website and was looking through some of your articles and your research and everything. So, I mean, as sort of a way of introduction, why don't you tell everyone a bit about yourself and what you're doing on the website and whatnot?
Right. Well, I think the way I come at things is it's basically formed from three directions. One is the experiences I had when I was growing up in Chester, in the northwest of England, which is a very historical, ancient Roman city. That's what started me off in my interest in history. And then went on to university in Manchester and studied history there. And then I went to Japan, and that was the second sort of formative factor in the way I look at things, and tried for 7 years to understand sort of East-West questions in terms of the experiences I was having there. And that left me with a number of questions. And then I came back to the West, to Europe in 1981. And pretty soon after coming back, I came across the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, the founder of what he called Anthroposophy, or spiritual science. And I found that answered a number of the questions which had arisen in my 20s when I was in Japan. And then from that took me into studying a movement art, which he developed. And so my wife and I did a 4-year training in that particular movement art. And then interestingly, almost as soon as I graduated from that training, then my historical interests, which were very particular in relation to the First World War, trying to understand the 20th century, came back again. So I was, 36 at that time. And then I tried to combine these two interests for about 7 or 8 years. And after that time, I realized, I couldn't really, so one of them would have to go. So I dropped the Eurythmy at that point, the movement art called Eurythmy, not Eurythmics, Eurythmy, and focused on history and trying to understand the 20th century. And that's what then took me into writing and lecturing, and that's where I am now. So at the moment, I do basically 3 things. I'm a translator of German and Japanese. I give talks on history and current events, and I also write for a couple of magazines regularly. One I can show you one of those. This is a quarterly magazine. Can you see that?
New View.
New View magazine. That's a quarterly magazine. And then the other one is this one here, which is The Present Age. Is a monthly magazine based in Switzerland. It's coming out of Switzerland. That's the German version of it. So there's a German version, and then I translate the English version, which is called the Present Age. Wow. The German version is called the European, and the English version is called the Present Age. Wow. So I translate that from German into English, and that's one of my regular things that I do.
Was that Perseus holding the head of the Medusa aloft there?
It was indeed, yeah, that's right.
Oh.
Yeah, and that has to do with the sort of the stage in development where we move from a stage where we're, as it were, back when, shall we say, approximately before the 8th century BC, 1000 BC, where human beings were still in what you might call almost a clairvoyant state. And then we move from that clairvoyant state or picture consciousness into more of a situation where human beings are able to think for themselves rather than having divine beings think through them. So the Medusa is a symbol or being who still had that capacity, symbolized by the snakes in the head, for this ancient, rather atavistic capacity to be thought through, so to speak. Yeah? And Perseus is a representative of what was coming, of the new capacity for individuals to think for themselves, which is why he had the shield, in order to guard himself against the sort of forces, the instinctive atavistic forces which she had.
Right.
That's what the symbol is about.
You mentioned Rudolf Steiner there, who's quite famous in sort of esoteric circles and people who research theosophy and whatnot. I've read, he wrote a book which was like an introduction to theosophy. And I read that a few years ago. And I am actually reading a collection of sort of talks and articles that, about Eurythmy that was compiled of his work now, and I'm struggling a bit, to be honest. It's quite a difficult sort of concept.
I'm not surprised, because I mean I was struggling too when I first came across that, and that's because in Japan I'd been involved with improvisational dance and music, electronic music mostly, and we did these improvisational gigs. Which combine poetry and lights and dancing and music and so on. And eventually I got a bit frustrated with that, and I felt the need to get into music in a more systematic, structured and disciplined way, if you will. And it's at that point that we came back to this country. And then we went to Steiner House in London and saw a performance of Eurythmy for the first time. And although it was kind of way beyond me in a way, I couldn't really understand what they were doing, of course, but I did recognize that what they were doing combined all the things that we'd been trying to do in Tokyo. Dancing, lights, movement lights, speech. They were moving to speech, they were moving to music, they had this remarkable light show. So that was all these things. I thought, I'd like to know more about that. So like you, I started looking at Steiner's lectures on Eurythmy, and I couldn't make much of it. So in the end, I said, well, maybe I have to try and do some of this. And so my wife and I started going to courses for adults. And that's how I gradually got into it.
I would like to ask you sort of, you mentioned Anthroposophy. Yeah, I got it. You gave us, what was the trick you said to say it just before we started recording?
It's like anthropology, right? Or it's the same stress pattern as anthropology, and it's anthroposophy. Or you can think of it as a person with one name. The first name is Anthro, and the second name is Mr. Posophy. So Anthroposophy. Anthroposophy.
Now, was Steiner a contemporary of Blavatsky and these other folks who were sort of crucial in the formation of Theosophy?
She was born, as I recall, in 1831, and he was born in 1861. So she was a generation before. And I think she died in 1891, thereabouts, and he died in 1925. So he's the next generation, really. Yeah.
But didn't Steiner start off as in the Theosophical Society and then Anthropos, and then came to bring about Anthroposophy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes and no is the answer to that question. Yeah. Because Steiner really started in philosophy, so he was focused above all really on the nature of what is thinking, what do we do when we think, and so he wrote a number of, that was his PhD, and he wrote a number of books on those subjects first, and then he went from there into, because he'd been educated as a young man in the natural sciences, he went into editing the scientific works of Goethe. And so he did that for about 7 years. And then moved from, that was in Weimar in Germany, then he moved to Berlin. And because of the friends and associates he'd made in Berlin, he got to know some people who were moving in theosophical circles. And when they found out what he was interested in, they asked him if he could give some talks. So he started off giving a talk on Goethe's fairy story, the green snake and the beautiful lily. This was what I showed you just before was
on the cover
actually this picture, and that's actually an illustration of from that, the green snake and beautiful lily. It's a fairy story which Goethe, deeply symbolic, which Goethe wrote. And so he gave some talks on that to people who were sort of either in or associated with Theosophical Society, just because they were the people who asked him to do that. Yeah. And gradually they asked him to give more talks about esoteric matters. And so he did. And then eventually it was suggested that he become the leader of the German section of the Theosophical Society, which he did in 1902. But those people were what we could call the New Agers of that time, yeah. And they were looking, as I'm sure you know, Blavatsky was very much focused on Asia,
the East, yeah.
In particular on Buddhism. And of course, the Theosophical Society even relocated to India in 1879, I think it was, and had its headquarters in Adyar in India. So although they were Westerners, they were very much focused on Indian spirituality. Not entirely, they were trying to make sense of spirituality in general, but they were particularly focused on Indian spirituality. And Steiner felt, well, this is not really appropriate for the modern time, because the modern time is also a time of science. So how can you try to relate science and natural science and spiritual science? And also, because by that time he'd also, I think you could really describe him in the 1880s, in his 20s, as a kind of agnostic, really. But round about the turn of the century, round about 1899, 1900, he had a particular experience of the Christ being, and from that time he really embraced Christianity. And he also felt, as he began to give talks about esotericism, that in a Western context, given our tradition and background in Christianity in this particular culture, that this had to be integrated into esotericism, and esotericism had to be connected with that and natural science. Yeah, so he gradually began to drift away, you could say, and distance himself from the more very Indian-influenced stream of theosophy. And eventually he and the Theosophists fell out in from about 1909, 1910 onwards, when the Theosophists, by that time it was the Englishwoman Annie Besant who was leading the Theosophists, when she produced the young man Jiddu Krishnamurti, and claimed that this young man was like the Christ figure or the Messiah or the world teacher. Yeah? And Steiner just felt, well, this is definitely not right. And so he really distanced himself from Theosophy at that time. And Theosophy, of course, means the wisdom of God, and Anthroposophy means the wisdom of human being, in the sense that the human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So then finally in 1912, 1913, the two went their own way, and he founded the Anthroposophical Society, and they separated from him and distanced themselves from him as well. So that's how that all developed.
It's quite funny how you mentioned the Theosophical Society being focused on the East, and it seems to me that we've had sort of like an echo of that in the 1960s. Similar sort of movement.
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, I think we could say that, a very great deal of what happened in the 1960s was already there prefigured in the period, let's say, well, at the outside, 1890 to until the First World War, that period, right? But at that time, it was mostly fairly well-heeled people, fairly wealthy people who were discovering all these things. But many of the things which we associate with the New Age or with the 1960s, whether it be vegetarianism or veganism or nudism or promiscuous sexuality or drug taking, cocaine, whatever, all these things, they were doing that then. But they tended to be people who, as I say, were pretty wealthy. Whereas in the 1960s, all these things were much more democratized, weren't they? But very many similarities.
There was a bit of sort of an upper crust element in the 60s as well, from bits that I've read, like Goa, for example, was sort of I don't know. I just got the impression that it was sort of a middle class. I'm probably being horribly generalizing here, but it's like a middle class playground. Explore yourself. Daddy can afford to send me to Goa for a couple of years, and I'll experiment and find myself and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in 1981, on the way back to Japan, my wife and I went to India for 3 months, and because we had a friend who was at the ashram of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and so we went to visit this guy. We stayed there for 2 weeks, and that was quite an interesting experience, because there we saw, and this kind of bears out what you're saying in a way, that if you'd wondered in 1981 where all the hippies had gone, the wealthy hippies, they were all there. Mostly Americans and Germans. Yeah.
Bhagwan, is that? Sorry, Terry, is that the Bhagwan who they made a Netflix documentary about a few years ago? Who he relocated to America? They bought some land.
That's him. He relocated to Oregon and renamed himself Osho.
Osho, that's it.
Or maybe I'm not quite sure about that. He may have been renamed after that, after he died, which I think was in about 1990 or so. But that was the second name that was given to him, or that he took on, Osho, O-S-H-O. So yeah, that's the man. And he went to Oregon and got into some trouble there with the local authorities. Yeah. But anyway, as I said, those people were all there. The wealthier hippies in the late 70s, the professional people, and the ashram there was incredibly well stocked, and they had all mod cons and everything, compared to the surroundings in Pune where it was. But back in the 60s, I mean, if you think of people like, whether it be the Beatles or the Who, or these people appealed to working class boys and girls, and those kind of boys and girls, teenagers, grew up with these bands, and they went through the whole process. I mean, I was a little bit young. I mean, I was only 18 in 1970 when I went to uni. But I'd experienced a lot of that whole 60s scene, going to music gigs and what have you. So you could see that, it really was much more democratizing than was the case 60 years previously. It had a much wider social base.
I just wanted to go back to something you were saying about Steiner and him having like not a Damascene moment, but he had an experience, a religious experience, which sort of turned him in a certain direction. I mean, I'm guessing he would have classed himself as a Christian.
Well, certainly he did from then on, yeah.
And this is something that I've been wrestling with of late. Would you call yourself a Christian, Terry?
Definitely, yeah.
Well, maybe you can help me, because I've been interested in esoteric subjects for quite a number of years now, and you get exposed to different ideas, particularly with Theosophy and about star worship and the zodiac and symbolism and all these things. And I wanted to ask you, how are you able to reconcile your sort of knowledge of esotericism with a belief in Christ?
Well, one of the things, I mean, first of all, Blavatsky was not well disposed towards Christianity, not at all. But one of the things that Theosophy and Anthroposophy, her ideas and Steiner's ideas do have in common, is that they seek to understand the whole development of human spirituality from its earliest beginnings. So it's very much a question of the development and evolution of human consciousness, and therefore the various kinds of religions and spiritual movements which emerged in relation to that developing human consciousness. Yeah, like I was saying before about Medusa and Perseus. So that's definitely something which they have in common. So because Steiner had that perspective, he wanted to show how to bridge Christianity to the pre-Christian spirituality, and also to post-Christian spiritual streams like, whether it be streams of Christian mysticism in the Middle Ages, or Islam, which is also, of course, post-Christian, and so on, yeah? And that was very, very interesting to me, because when I'd been in Japan in those 7 years, and I hadn't known anything about Steiner or Anthroposophy in those days, in the 70s, that became a real burning question to me, how to bridge this seemingly huge gap between East and West, between cultures like Japan and England, for example. Yeah? That became a very, very urgent question. I mean, one book I came across which was very helpful in this regard was this one, Ways of Thinking of Eastern Peoples by Hajime Nakamura. This was a very helpful book to understand the differences between Indians, Chinese, Tibetans, and Japanese, particularly in their different approaches to Buddhism. Because I was particularly interested in Zen, I suppose, at that time. But this book really helped me to see how Buddhism, which many people in the West in the 70s had a rather vague idea about, and how Buddhism was very, very differentiated according to these various cultures. But how to then make the connection between Buddhism and these various streams and Christianity, that was hard to do in Japan. And I didn't come across any Japanese spiritual teachers who were able to do that. They essentially said to me as a Westerner, they said, well, they said very politely, they said, your culture is a mistake in spiritual terms. Yeah, your culture has gone wrong. Your culture has gone off the rails, so to speak. And what you need to do is come home to where we are. And of course, that is where many New Agers were, and many hippies in the 60s. Yeah, they also felt that Western culture and Western spirituality was all wrong, and it had gone wrong, and we needed to go back to the truth, which was in the East. That's how they saw it.
Yeah, a rejection of materialism.
Yeah, exactly. But I always felt, I guess because I had this sense of being this deep, deep interest in history since I was about 8. I felt whenever those Japanese spiritual teachers said that to me, I just knew somehow in my bones, no, this isn't right. There's a reason why the West went in this path. There's a reason why the West went in the direction of logic, in the direction of even of materialism, in the direction ultimately of science and technology. There's a reason for that. And that also made me want to discover what was the connection? How can one bridge these two cultures? And I couldn't find answers to those questions until I encountered Steiner. That's why I was so interested in him.
Now, as far as my reading goes, particularly recent reading, I've been sort of tracing this back to, well, some would say Descartes and some would say Francis Bacon, and then the Royal Society, and that this was the big sort of diverging moment.
Yeah.
Do you think that's accurate? Or?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, the 17th century was, because you can see after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, then a lot of the ancient classical wisdom, which had not been available in Europe, made its way over to Italy and was one of the things that really got the Italian Renaissance going. Yeah? And that led on to Hermeticism, Hermetic esotericism. And then you got other streams coming in, like the whole Christian Judaic, or the Christian Hebraic stream, and trying to understand the Hebrew language and what that had to say about God's intentions and so on. But that whole period of the 15th century and 16th century, what you might call the Hermetic stream, very transitional between what was before and then this more thoroughgoing natural science, which we recognize today, as you mentioned, with people like Bacon and the Royal Society, Galileo, Newton, Hooke, and so on. Yeah, it really is. It really was in the 17th century that European Western natural science took off. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the Medicis. I think they were famous for wanting to find any sort of ancient text they could and make copies and translate them, and just sort of obsessed with gathering knowledge from the ancient Greek writers and stuff. Yeah, whatever had been sort of whatever had survived sort of the Dark Ages, when it was the guys in the monasteries they were writing the Christian texts, and if they had time, they would copy a bit of Plato or whatnot, or they might write over some Plato with, I don't know, Augustine or something. Right.
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, a lot of that Platonic knowledge had been lost to Europe. They had a little bit, but not very much at all. And it really was in the late Middle Ages that a lot of this Platonic or Neoplatonic wisdom was rediscovered, and that was one of the things that sparked the likes of Pico della Mirandola to get the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance going, with all the translations made at that time. So yeah, that was very, 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 very important. But I think there was a sense in which that what happened there in the 15th century, when Constantinople was taken by the Turks, that a whole period of history, which we could call the Greco-Roman culture from our European perspective, the Greco-Roman culture going back to approximately the 8th century BC, that really comes to a kind of an end in the 15th century. And so you see in the Italian Renaissance, it's like a kind of autumnal flowering that happens there. So in incredible amounts of beauty in the world of the arts, for example, in many different ways, with Leonardo and Michelangelo and the various other painters and sculptors. But it's a real flowering, like you have in autumn, but it's the end of something. It's not something that goes forward to the future. And when they tried to take that forward to the future in for example, architecture, then what Europe then experienced was, Georgian architecture, classical architecture based on Vitruvius and classical models, very static, very non-dynamic, or many of the the mathematical images which came into European gardening and such things, in the French gardening in particular, in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So this was all coming from the Greco-Roman culture. It wasn't new in any way. There were one of the few things that was really new, of course, that came in that period was perspective. But the Greeks and the Romans hadn't had perspective in the way that the Europeans developed it in the late Middle Ages.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to go back to Christianity.
Yeah, sure.
You hear all sorts about the figure of Jesus. A lot of the sort of people in esoterica, they will downplay Jesus, either from a historicity point of view, or they'll say the Bible's all allegory. There's no truth in it. And this is what I'm really struggling with at the moment.
Right. Mm-hmm.
How do we? What's your view? I mean, do you follow like a certain branch of Christianity as far as all the tenets that go with it, like the virgin birth and the resurrection and all the what?
No, I don't.
What's your like reading of Steiner? How has that informed your take on Christianity?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have a Christian upbringing. I mean, like many English people of my generation, we just celebrated, in inverted commas, Christmas in terms of Christmas trees and presents, and Easter was Easter eggs. We didn't go to church. I didn't have a Christian upbringing in that sense, and my schooling was so savage that and so hypocritical that we had a Christian service every morning, and then we had corporal punishment for the rest of the day, and that kind of put me off for many years. Yeah, I mean, having that day after day after day, right? That really put me off Christianity, and I think a lot of people in my generation were, and I also didn't come across any people who, at that time in the 60s, who I could say were in my own life were say upstanding Christian priests or representatives of the faith. Yeah, but it was a gradual process, really, Phil, that when I was in Japan, for example, I noticed that although Japan was nominally a Buddhist culture or Shinto culture, that's the native Japanese religion, pre-Buddhist, I noticed, however, that there was, even in things like TV dramas and the like and movies, that there was a sense of what I, as a Westerner, recognize as the motif of crucifixion and resurrection, in the sense that you saw again and again the people going through tremendous pain and suffering and then coming out the other side, or meeting evil in really difficult ways and then getting through that, in again various different ways, either by transforming the person who'd done evil to them, or in some sense gaining a kind of victory over that. Yeah.
Are there no parallels to of that in the Eastern traditions? Then is that a very Western kind of happening?
I think it's a big difference. That's Ben, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. Hi. Sorry.
I think that was a big difference, Ben, between Christianity and Buddhism. That in Buddhism, there's very little said about the whole question of evil. Yeah. Very little at all. I mean, you hear that Mara, the sort of a somewhat of a demonic figure, tries to prevent the Buddha from gaining enlightenment, and at the point where he's about to break through, and so on. Yeah, but there's very little of that. Yeah, and whereas, as you know, Christianity, Jesus goes through, well, some of the worst things that human beings can throw at each other. It's not only in terms of discrediting him verbally, but actual real serious physical torture and eventually death. And that, I found, also is a very big and very important phenomenon, that the East, the whole special, I mean, if you look, for example, at Eastern Buddhist iconography, it's all in the sense of beauty and glory and things which are statues which are light filled and the like. Yeah? Whereas if you look in the West, you see how Christian iconography itself goes through an evolution from the early Byzantine iconography, where you see Christ as cosmic judge or Pantocrator, the king on the throne. Surrounded, everything is in gold. And then you go forward into the Middle Ages, and you come into Western Europe, and then you come to the figure of the Man of Sorrows. You come to the paintings of Grunewald, for example, which is pretty, even now is pretty hard to look at. It's blood, sweat, and tears. It's pain, sorrow, and suffering. It's agony. It's all of this, and that is all within the Christian development of Christian consciousness in the West. Very different from what you have in the East.
Sorry, I was going to say, in our intro video, the picture that flashed up at the end was the Christ Pantocrator from St. Catherine's Monastery. It's in Israel. I can't remember where it is now. It's not Hebron. Sinai.
It's not in the Sinai, isn't it?
It's in the Sinai, yeah. And it's I think it's the earliest surviving Byzantine piece of iconography. And what's cool about it is you can put a mirror down the middle of it, and it sort of reflects this dual nature, like you described, like the judge, the sort of deity judge, and then the sort of human side on the other side of the image, which is really cool.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I mean, I think, going back to your question, there was this issue of, for me, this issue of crucifixion and resurrection, to put it generally. Yeah, but of course, what, for example, Steiner says about crucifixion and resurrection is much more specific. And for him, it's never what Jesus taught that's important. It's what Jesus did, or rather what Christ did through Jesus. And another big difference with conventional Christianity is that he was very emphatic. There was no virgin birth. There was no Christ, the solar logos, was not born of a human woman. The Christ, the solar logos, entered into the man Jesus at the baptism in the Jordan.
Wow.
And there is still a kind of memory of that, you see, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the fact that they make a very big deal of Epiphany, which 6th of January, yeah, which is both the celebration of the three kings coming to one of the Jesus children. That's another point. There wasn't one Jesus child, there were two, and because there are two Jesus genealogies, yeah, and then also that was the date of the baptism in the Jordan. Whereas we in the West, we focus on the other genealogy, if you will, the genealogy that leads to one of the other two Jesus children. Yeah, and then of course, when these two children, or rather, when one of these two children becomes 12 years old, we have the scene of the in the temple, where the Jesus is found
schooling them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this astonishes everybody because it's a case of, well, where did he get this from? All this wisdom. Yeah?
They grow up so fast.
Kind of points out that that's because at that point, one of the two children died, and one of those two children was the reincarnate was a human child. It was a reincarnation of Zarathustra.
Whoa!
Okay, so this child had many incarnations on Earth, and one of them was Zarathustra. So that was a great deal of wisdom was included with that child. Yeah, but that child then merged, so to speak, with the other child, who was a child who had no incarnations at all previously. So this child had incarnated for the first time. And this explains why suddenly this child had this incredible wisdom. So in effect, there were two Jesus children and there were two Jesus families. And actually, if you look, you can even find, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head now the name of the painter, but there was even the painting in the Italian Renaissance, which hints very much at these two children and this mystery, because it really is a mystery. There's a book, by the way, which I would recommend to anybody interested in this, by a man called David Overson. You may have come across this.
How do you spell that? How do you spell that, too?
David, Ovason. And he also wrote a very interesting book called The Secret Zodiacs of Washington, D.C., which has a bit of a wacky title, but the content of it is really incredibly well researched. But anyway, this book I'm mentioning now is about the two Jesus children, specifically about the mystery of the two Jesus children. And he goes into it in great detail. So this is a deep hidden mystery which belongs to esoteric Christianity. Two Jesus families, two Jesus genealogies, two Jesus families, two Jesus children, which then become one at the age of 12. And then that one human being goes on to the baptism in the Jordan. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the Bible tells us virtually nothing, in fact, about what happened to Jesus between 12 and 30. And then at the baptism in the Jordan, what happens there is that the ego, if you will, the self of this Jesus young man is given up and is replaced into into his physical vessel, into his physical vehicles, incarnates the solar logos for just 3 years. So the solar logos incarnates into Jesus for 3 years only. Yeah,
there's
and
a lot.
Goes through the mystery of Golgotha. So, this is obviously, most traditional Christians will say, well, this is complete. I would have been burnt at the stake in the Middle Ages, and so would Rudolf Steiner. And most biblical fundamentalists in America and elsewhere, or Britain too, wouldn't warrant this for a moment. But as far as I'm concerned, I just look at what the fundamentalists say, and I look at their biblical studies and the arguments they put forward. And I look at Rudolf Steiner's Christology, and I know which makes more sense to me. And in the end, we can only test this by the use of our own reason and by the use of our own experience, right?
There's a heck of a lot to unpack there, isn't there?
You've broken Phil.
Yeah, you've completely broken my head. Right, so two children. Oh, are we talking twins? Are we talking Jesus and Thomas, or Jesus and James, or is it two in one?
No, they're not. They're two families.
Oh, so, is this the priestly line?
The shepherd, exactly. The shepherds come to one child. The three kings come to another child. These are different children, you see. When you start to see this, a lot of things begin to make sense. Yeah,
there's no sheep in the desert.
So there's the kingly line, presumably from King David, and then a priestly line that goes back to Moses or Aaron.
Yeah, the priestly line. Yeah.
Right. So the kings visit the descendant of David. The shepherds visit the descendant of Moses. Yeah,
the so-called wise men who come from come from where? Come from the Magi, yeah? Come from Chaldea, which at that time was within the Persian cultural region. They knew that Zarathustra, and now we come to another big issue, that the being who was Zarathustra was reincarnating.
Wow.
That's the other point that Steiner brings into Christian esotericism. He said that, reincarnation now has to return to the West. Because you probably know, the ancient pagan Celts, they were familiar with the concept of reincarnation or transmigration of souls. Yeah? And there was a reason why, and this is very profound, that the West had to, as it were, lose reincarnation for a while. And that whole idea had to be pushed out of Christianity and pushed out of Western culture by the church. And then why now it has to come back in, and it's absolutely urgent and crucial that it comes back in. Yeah? I'm not saying, of course, that it was Rudolf Steiner that brought back reincarnation. I mean, you can find, I think, one of the very first people who began to talk in the West about reincarnation was the German writer Lessing in the late 18th century. Yeah? Lessing, Lessing. But Steiner was very insistent that it's really vital that reincarnation comes back now, because a certain enormous process is taking place. How can I explain this in a nutshell to make it simple? It is that approximately 3,000 years before Christ, we all know the rock band, The Doors, and people know, well, that comes from the Doors of Perception, and you have William Blake and so on, right? But the Doors of Perception, what are they? The Doors of Perception were that's a reference to the fact that ancient peoples, when they were born, they more or less had natural clairvoyance. So when people were born, the spiritual world was all around them. And even today, some little children still have something of this experience. Not many, perhaps, but some still do. And in other words, they can communicate with elemental beings, or they see their angel, or they see the spiritual world. They perceive the spiritual world. Well, our ancestors, many, if not most of them, could do that. But around about 3000 BC, those doors of natural clairvoyance, as we descended more and more deeply into this material world, they had to close off. And to the point where, by the time of Christ in the Roman Empire, we were deeply into materialism. Of course, by the 19th century, we'd go into materialism even deeper. In fact, we'd go down below nature into what Steiner would call subnature. with the discovery of electricity and magnetism and so on. But they were already deep in there at the time of the Roman Empire. Well, you just got to think about what the Roman Empire was like and compare it to ancient Egypt or ancient Persia, ancient India, ancient China. You know, what was the Roman Empire like? The Roman Republic even more than the Roman Empire. It's a deeply grounded culture. Its focus is on the material world, not the spiritual world in the way that the Indians were focused on the spiritual world. Yeah? So the humanity at that point had come really down to earth, and we were in danger, as it were, of losing our connection with the spiritual world altogether. And so the Solar Logos incarnated into Jesus Christ into Jesus, the human being Jesus, because he needed to effect something. He needed to do something, not give a teaching about love and compassion, which had been given by many teachers, Eastern Oriental teachers before, including the Buddha himself. He had to actually reverse or change the direction of the entirety of humanity, so that we ourselves would be, having become, as it were, crucified on the cross of matter, the whole of humanity would now begin gradually, of course, to resurrect. Yeah? And this will be a long process taking many millennia going on into the future, just as the whole coming down to the mystery of Golgotha, coming down to the cross, that also had taken many millennia. So it's not just the Christ being who went through this whole process with us, and he'd actually accompanied us through all this process of the incarnation of ourselves, the incarnation even of the planet, condensing out of the spirit deeper and deeper into matter, and we human beings doing the same with it. Yeah? And of course, we can, if we find this is all too bizarre, then, you know, I think we can actually experience something of this, because we actually all went through it. We all went through being little children and becoming teenagers. We remember more or less what we were like as teenagers and what kind of experiences we went through as teenagers, what it means to be a teenager, and why teenagers don't skip anymore. You know, they don't skip. They walk around as if the world is on their shoulders, many of them. They talk in monotones. They're miserable. They get suicidal and so on and so forth. You know, well, you know all that. But if you compare that with the consciousness of a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old, you know, you can see that the child in growing up, in inverted commas, actually goes down in terms of the body grows up, but the consciousness, in a certain sense, constricts. It becomes materialistic. And the human being, in that sense, recapitulates the whole process of the human spirituality. So this is what Christ came to help us to overcome, as it were. Now, the Christian church, of course, traditionally has expressed that in terms of Christ came to save us from our sins and the original sin of Adam and Eve, and that whole story of the fall. And of course, there was a fall. There was a fall from the spirit into matter. So we gradually forgot the spiritual world, and we gained something. We gained natural science, like we were saying before, the 17th century. Yeah? We gained the world of technology. But we've now got to the point where, if we're not careful, technology is going to destroy us. And that's where we could get into a conversation about, you know, Klaus Schwab and the WEF and so on and so forth. Yeah. But that's where we're going. That's why this 21st century, 21 centuries after Christ, is so important. But Steiner is saying that we have to realize that already in his time, the doors of perception were now opening again. Yeah. Right. So gradually, from the 20th century onwards, you're starting to get human beings who are born with the faculty, once again, of natural clairvoyance. The problem was that when this happened in the West, because of the past 2,000 years of Western culture, Western people were not able to make sense of this. So many Western people were beginning to have experiences that they were crossing the threshold unconsciously, more or less unconsciously, into the spiritual world, having all kinds of bizarre and weird experiences which they couldn't make sense of. seeing beings, hearing voices, and all the rest of it. Yeah? And that's increased since Steiner's time, and it's going on increasing. And our traditional Christian teaching doesn't help us to understand that, not at all. The people who rely on the word of the Bible only, or the word of Scripture, in my experience, it cannot help people to understand what is happening to them or what's been happening these last 100 years.
And I guess it's been tinkered with so much over the years, hasn't it? You know, with whether it be the ecumenical councils or, you know, the selection of which books are going to make the cut and which books aren't. You know, we could go down the sort of the Gnostic route, all those Gospels of Thomas and whatnot that didn't make it. You know, and these are decisions made by men. What's going to be the teaching, you know?
Exactly, Phil. And there Steiner makes a very good point when he says that, for example, you know, as I said before, we lose something, we gain something. So when we gradually lost this direct ability to see into the spiritual world, we gained the faculty to think for ourselves as individuals. And you can see, you've only got to look at the development of human art, right? If you look at Greek art or Egyptian art, and you compare their portrayal of the human being with the portrayal of the human being you see in Roman art of, say, the 3rd century, or even the 1st century, but particularly the later Roman centuries, you look at the mosaics, you look at the faces, you're looking at individuals, right? With people with personalities. You look at Greek art, even the most beautiful Athenian art of, say, the 5th century, you're looking at perfect bodies, perfect, tremendous technique, but you're still looking at types. And when you go back even earlier to Egyptian art, then you're looking there at almost cosmic forms. You know, you're looking at something which is not even, despite the massiveness of it, it's somehow not quite on this planet. Yeah. But when you come to that Roman art, then you feel this is a person, this is a personality. And of course, that goes on in European art through the Renaissance, yeah? And so at that time, in the centuries, the early Christian centuries after Christ, the theologians and the so-called doctors of the church, they were now able to think for themselves as human beings. But that also meant they began to make very understandable human errors in their thinking, because their thinking was now becoming increasingly intellectual. They'd substituted intellectual thinking for the spiritual vision which previous generations of human beings had. Yeah. Now, today, many people, particularly again in the New Age or in the 60s, I could see this already, people would say, oh, that's terrible. You know, it's terrible that they'd lost, you know, that they had no view. Look at these arguing and even persecuting each other, calling each other heretics and so on and so forth. Well, yeah, it was pretty ugly. You know, they used to fight each other. They used to anathematize. They used to eventually kill each other and so on.
Albigensian crusade.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the worst examples, if not possibly the worst. Yeah? But going back to the time of the early church and the church councils, that was happening because they were thinking for themselves. They were thinking in an intellectual way. They were no longer regarding themselves as vessels through whom the gods spoke. Yeah, they were thinking as individual people, and so they began to argue. And that's where, or as you said, all these things began to be censored, cut out, etc., etc.
Right.
And the dogmas and the heresies and the anathemas.
You're right. Yeah, got you. And you can trace that back, like you said, you know, from the church fathers or from the Council of Nicaea forwards through to the present day. It's still going on, which is sad, but it's the way humans are. But sort of getting away from humans, I wanted to ask you about some of the nasty stuff, about evil, about Lucifer, Ahriman. Sorat is one that I came across the other day, who I've never heard of Sorat before.
Yeah.
But I believe Steiner was sort of involved in trying to describe these characters and what their relevance is, and maybe what we need to be looking out for in the current day.
Well, absolutely, because I mean, again, you know, he was one of his points was that in this particular age of history, which is since the 15th century, right? So from the 15th century going forward until about the 4th millennium, one of the major focuses of our period of history is in fact going to be the focus on what you could call good and evil. Now, I know some people say, oh, no, God, what a hackneyed subject, good and evil, that binary. Why do we have to deal with that binary? Well, the point is that good and evil is actually the question of freedom. There is no human freedom without evil. That's the whole role of evil in the world. The Gnostics and some of those who came earlier on, unfortunately, they too had come to the point where, and this began already in Persia with the Zarathustrians, the Zarathustrian religion, that they convinced themselves that there was, as it were, almost like a parallel evil cosmos. So there was a good cosmos and a bad cosmos. There's a light cosmos and a dark cosmos. And that's not how it is. The question is that if there is to be a humanity that finds its way to a cosmos and a humanity of love, this has to happen through human free choice.
Yes.
And that can only happen if there is a darkness, there is a shadow, there is a resistance against that human free choice. Yeah. Otherwise, we remain for all time puppets of God.
Exactly.
And that's not what God wants for us. God wants us to find his. I mean, we see this even in some of the Bible stories, the prodigal son and the like. That God wants us to find our own way back to him, her, it. Yeah.
And the free will is the key point. I've said it a million times on this podcast already, but my favourite quote from the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through the centre of every man's heart. And it's absolutely true. We all think, we all love to think that we're good and we're good people. But when the test comes, a lot of people fail. And every single one of us is capable of doing horrendous, horrific things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what humanity learned to do in the again from the Western perspective, but you can also see this from. I mean, I could talk about Asian parallels as well. Yeah, and it's very, very clear in say the 5th, 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC, for example, is humanity learned gradually to think for itself, and by the 4th century AD, this was really, really happening. In those centuries BC, yeah, in the West, for example, people like Pythagoras, yeah, and that time, the Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, humanity begins to think for itself. It's a slow process, but it begins. And that is something which, it's a process which has to go on. And in that period, humanity becomes really concerned with the question of truth and untruth. Yeah. For example, they were particularly concerned with the truth or the untruth of birth and death. What happens at birth and death? What happens when we die? What is the whole process of human life from birth to death? What is the truth about birth and death? These questions really concern people in that period. I mean, you could say that's a kind of a binary, the gate of the moon, birth, the gate of the sun, death, yeah? Gabriel, Michael, these two archangels who stand at these two gates, as it were.
Yeah.
And then in our time, however, the question is not so much, although of course, obviously truth still is very, very important. Of course it is. But the real question for us now that we can think for ourselves, it's not just a case of thinking for ourselves. I mean, it doesn't matter how clever you are and how much you can think for yourself. If you're not a moral human being, you'll put your newfound capacity to think at the service of evil or the service of stupidity. I mean, think of all the really clever young computer nerds, for example, at the age of 12 or 13. Yeah, they're brilliant. Yeah, they may be brilliant on their computers at that age, but they may not be very ethically developed as young people. Yeah? But then we've got to put our capacities to think for ourselves at the service of the good. So we come into the question of what is good and evil, and how can evil be not so much overcome and destroyed, but transformed. And that's the deep sense of the Manichaean question. Yeah? Many people confuse Manichaeism with this, what I was saying before, parallel universe, good, evil. But I think the deeper understanding of Manichaeism is about entering into evil so that you can transform it from within. And that's going to take us a long time, way on into the 4th century and beyond. Sorry, the 4th millennium and beyond. So that's our task for now.
Wow. Do you know, I could go on for another hour, but we've done an hour already. It's fascinating, Terry. And we didn't talk about Ahriman either.
Oh, gosh, yeah, we didn't. Yeah. Well, no. I mean, do you want to do 5 minutes on that before we just round that off?
Oh, go on then. Go on then, Terry. Tell us about Ahriman and Lucifer, if you could.
The white hand.
And if you can squeeze Sorat in, that'd be even better.
Fine. Okay. Well, because it's important for us to understand the forces of evil, and Steiner did a great deal to help us to understand these forces. Yeah. 2 of those forces, for example, are in this. You'll find. Can you see that?
Lucifer and Ahriman.
Yeah. Ahriman. Lucifer and Ahriman. Yeah. There's a course of what is it? About 5 lectures in 1919. Yeah, on Lucifer and Ahriman. How to understand Lucifer and Ahriman. Those are 2 of the forces of evil that we deal with in the world. Yeah. Lucifer obviously is a familiar name to us. Ahriman is not. By Ahriman, Steiner really means the being who in the West we call Satan. These are not the same being. And the Christian church in the early Christian centuries, because of those reasons I mentioned earlier, they not only lost direct vision into the higher worlds, the worlds of the angels, they also lost vision into the worlds of the demons in the demonic realm, so to speak. Yeah? So they lost discrimination there, and they gradually fused these beings. And regarded them, Beelzebub, Mammon, Lucifer, Ahriman, they're all the same thing. And particularly the devil, all of these become the one being for Bible fundamentalist Christians. Yeah? And Steiner says, no, these are not the same thing. And you can understand them very simply, and they're in your own hands. And the one is this, the fist. If you make a fist with your right hand, and the other is with your left hand, you make this, for example. And what he meant by that was that they are the 2 principles of radical contraction, which is the fist, and radical expansion, which is the waving hand. If you do it waving rather than just holding a hand like so, yeah, I mean, you can do it that way, then it's clearer because this is more mobile and more fluid, right? Whereas this is obviously the radical fist is the most contracted. And that's what these 2 forces of evil are. Radical, and they are beings. Yeah? They're not abstractions. Contraction and expansion are just abstract concepts. But these are actual beings.
Actual external beings.
Absolutely, as real as you and me, only even more so to speak. Yeah? And so if you think of the most radically contracted, logical, hard-brained scientist, and the most off-planet fantasy, illusion, dreamy artist, then you've got a kind of a poor stereotype of these 2 forces. Huh? Wow. But all of us tend in one of these 2 directions.
Right.
We incline in one of those 2 directions. And of course, the key is to find your balanced way between them. And interestingly, the Chinese do a gesture like this. You know of that. You see it in martial arts, yeah? Now, they bring together this. Sometimes you see it like this. Sometimes you see it like this. But it's the plane and the point.
Oh,
the
my
contraction
word.
and the periphery. And you bring the point and the periphery together, yeah? And you do that out of your center. And out of your center, you bow and show respect to the human being in front of you, right?
The Tai Chi salute, isn't it? It's the same.
What?
Tai Chi, it's a key salute point in Tai Chi.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ancient Chinese salute. But what you have there are these 2 fundamental forces of contraction and expansion. Those, by the way, Phil, are very much part of Eurythmy. Eurythmy is based to a large extent on the forces of contraction, expansion, and movement. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So then we got the 2 other forces. There are 2 other forces. These 2 forces of Lucifer and Ahriman. Lucifer preys on our feeling life. He seeks to seduce our feeling life. Ahriman seeks to use lies and deception to pollute our thinking life. So that's where the truth and the untruth comes in. Yeah. So he particularly is concerned with leading us astray in understanding the truth about things. For example, materialism. If you think that the whole world can be explained by 5 sense reality, that's a deception. That's a lie. And our natural science since the 17th century has been increasingly based on that, yeah? At least up until 1900, where we started to cross a certain threshold. But anyway, that's what Ahriman's concerned with. He's concerned with everything which has to do with lies and deceptions, particularly in the realm of science, finance, media, propaganda, anything to do with deception and lies in the realm of thinking. And whereas Lucifer leads you into the realm of spiritual inflation, pride, arrogance, fantasy, illusion, right?
Wow.
So we've got 2 other forms of evil to deal with. Now, in the movie The Matrix, there are 3 of these forms of illusion, of evil that Steiner talks about, which we can see portrayed very well in the Matrix movie. I'm sure both of you have seen them. Yeah? You can see the Lucifer form in the being who in the Matrix movie is called the Merovingian. And the whole situation with the Merovingian and even the Merovingian's girlfriend. And then whereas you see the Ahrimanic or the satanic element in 2 forms. One is the human architects of the Matrix itself, who Neo meets, surrounded by TV screens. Remember that scene? Yeah, it looks like an English professor, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And then the other form, which is more cosmic form, spiritual form in a certain sense, is the machine god. When Neo goes in the 3rd movie, he goes actually to see the god of the machines. Yeah, and these are the 2 forms in a certain sense of what's bound up with the whole realm of scientific inspiration, technological inspiration. This is coming from the Ahrimanic. We can't do without that. We need that. We need Ahriman. We need Satan even for the world of scientific technological expansion. Contraction and inspiration. We need the Luciferic for the world of the arts, because Lucifer is a world of beauty, a world of fantasy, imagination, and illusion, if you're not careful. We need those. But Christ is the being who holds the balance between these 2. And that's why Steiner created this remarkable 9-meter high wooden sculpture of the representative of humanity between these 2 forces. So those are those 2. And the 3rd one is the Asuras. And for some reason, which I myself haven't quite got to the bottom of yet, is that Steiner always referred to these beings as plural. Not as one Asura, but always as plural. And we see this being in the Matrix movie in Agent Smith. And we see particularly by the end of the movie where Agent Smith rebels in a sense against the Matrix, and he seeks to become himself out of the Matrix. But what does Agent Smith become? He becomes Legion. He becomes plural. And what is Agent Smith about more than anything else? Total annihilation. He's about the question of annihilation, destruction. And the 3rd force of evil, Steiner was saying, is that force which seeks to destroy the human physical body, so that the human spirit can no longer function in this physical world through a human physical vessel, do you see? Yeah. So whereas Ahriman seeks to destroy or pervert our thinking, Lucifer seeks to pollute and seduce our feeling. The Asuras seek to annihilate our physicality, our physical bodies. And the last of the
there's more. Is that not enough?
The last one. This has to do with the Sorat you were talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Sorat relates to the number 666 in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. Okay. The 2-horned beast who is there in the book of the Revelation. And this again would take too long to explain, more time than we have now. But the key to get hold of with this being is that this being attacks us not through the physical body, not through our thinking, not through our feeling, not through our thinking, which, by the way, our thinking is rooted in our in our life body. Yeah? It's related to our life body and our memory. But Sorat, the Sorat being, the 666 being, attacks our very ego. What this being is seeking to do is invert our self. Our self, our ego, is actually our possibility to be a sun being in the center of ourselves. It's through that which we make connection with the Christ. Yeah? But the Sorat being wishes to invert our ego, and this is why Steiner said this being is the being which is related to black magic, and that's why we see it in the symbol of, for example, Azov in Ukraine right now.
Azov Battalion, sun. The Black Sun.
The Black Sun, yeah. This is the Black Sun motif. Yeah? The Black Sun is the symbol of dark occultism, where the sun at the center of your being is black and is dark, and it's the symbol of black magic. And that's what that fourth principle of evil is about. So in this modern age, it really behooves us to try to understand these differences and to identify these differences in the world around us and the way that these four beings work. And of course, at the present time, we see them working overtime. Yeah? But three of them, I think we can recognize pretty clearly in the Matrix movie, for example.
Well, Terry, it's been absolutely fascinating.
Definitely.
And, I've really enjoyed meeting you and talking to you. It's been an absolute joy. The website's been on the screen if you've been watching. If you're listening, 3man.org. The link will be in the show notes. Check out Terry's work. And, please keep in touch. In fact, stay on the line for us just for 1 minute, Terry, while we play ourselves out. Yeah. And like I said, check the website out.
3man.org.
Got it.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks very much, Bill and Ben.
Our pleasure. See you shortly.
Yeah. Cheers.
Sorat.